So what grows here? I spent the last 6 years working as a greenkeeper and a university student trying to answer this question. And the answer depends where you look. It can either be very little or something quite remarkable. This is a golf course on the Sandwich Bay Estate, a site of special scientific interest and a special area of conservation. And those purple spikes are green winged orchids, a legally protected priority species, growing just 50 metres from the fairway that you saw in the last slide. So we know that sites like these are ecologically valuable, but what we don't know is what it is about the management that makes them so, and if it can be replicated across sites without the benefit of statutory designation. This is a very British landscape, and I think that if you asked a lot of people in the country to picture nature, I think they'd conjure up an image like this in their minds. A patchwork of fields, hedgerows, trees, perhaps some animals grazing. It looks green and it looks natural, but there's an element of generational amnesia at play here. We simply don't remember what our nature once looked like. Since the 1930s, we've lost 97% of our flower-rich meadows, replaced by monocultures, intensive grazing, agrochemicals. The insects that depended upon these, including bumblebees, have been losing ground ever since. Since 2024 was the worst year on record for bumblebees. They experienced a 22.5% decline in abundance on the previous decade's average. And protected areas help, of course, but they're not enough. You see, bumblebees don't recognise boundaries. They forage across entire landscapes. And if those landscapes are hostile without adequate nesting provision or floral resource, even the best protected areas become an island. Bumblebees aren't just charming, charismatic species, they're functional. 75% of major food crops worldwide depend upon insect pollination, and in the UK alone, that's estimated to be worth around £600 million a year. Without them, the food on our plate looks very different. Some of the food that we take for granted, like tomatoes, blueberries, aubergines, depend specifically on bumblebees for pollination. See, bumblebees can carry out something called sonication or buzz pollination, where they vibrate their flight muscles at a certain frequency, essentially shaking tightly held pollen from the anthers of flowers. Not every insect can do this. This is a short-haired bumblebee, Bombus subterraneus. It was declared nationally extinct in the UK in the year 2000. Its last population, right here on this coastline at Dungeness. It disappeared as the flower-rich grassland that it depended on was lost. It didn't vanish overnight, it retreated, site by site, nest by nest, and year by year. This trajectory of retreat, fragmentation, and local extinction is exactly what other bumblebee species are currently facing. So we have an urgent question to ask. If the protected areas of Dungeness weren't enough to sustain viable populations of the short-haired bumblebee, where else could we be looking? Golf courses. Not the obvious answer, but hear me out. There's 2,600 of them in the UK. They occupy 124,000 hectares of land cover. To put that into perspective, it's almost the size of Greater London. And unlike many other landscapes on our doorsteps, they haven't been sprayed to within an inch of their lives or ploughed into the ground. Well, not all of them. What does a golf course look like from an ecological perspective? Essentially, it's three habitats, a mosaic. You've got heavily managed fairway, which is here where the flag is. This is cut maybe 2, 3, 4 times a week sometimes. It receives heavy input from organic and chemical compounds, fertilizers, insecticides, pesticides, you name it. It's essentially a lawn, nothing's in flower. And then you have rough, which is this kind of intermediate area in the middle there. This receives input and management. It's cut maybe once or twice a month. It doesn't receive as much input as fairway, but still substantial. And the thing is with rough, the ball for a golfer must be retrievable, so they must be able to strike the ball out of that surface. So that constrains the cut, how high we cut it, and in turn that restrains what can flower there. And then you have out of play, this floristically diverse area in the front. This is managed differently. This is cut once a year, if that, and when it is cut, the clippings are collected. It's essentially a hay meadow. And this is Royal St George's, one of my 8 study sites, and also one of the most famous sporting venues in the world. It's home to the British Open, Every few years, thousands of people and the best golfers in the world flock to this site. From the air and on your television, it looks managed, looks pretty uniform, but let's zoom in. This is the same habitat mapped and classified, and that straw colour you can see is out of play area. 73% on a single site. That's 77 hectares of potentially amazing conservation land right there, sitting on a SSSI and SAC. But this isn't unique to Royal St George's. This structure appears across golf courses in the UK, and many of them also overlap with statutory designations. But get this, fewer than half have formal biodiversity management plans. So there's enormous potential, but it's misunderstood. And I wanted to understand it better, so I asked a question. Does the way we manage these habitats determine what species can survive there? And if so, what could we be doing differently? So I set out to survey 8 golf courses on the Kent and Sussex coast between April and June 2023. They spanned a gradient of conservation designations from SSSIs and SACs to totally undesignated sites. And I ensured that every single site was within 1.8 kilometres of a statutory designation, and I hope this would control for landscape context. And right there, clustered on the north portion of the coast, are the sites on Sandwich Bay, which you'll see become important as the presentation goes on. So on each golf course, I established 5 100-metre transects, 1 in fairway, 1 in rough, and 3 in out-of-play habitat. Wildflower surveys were carried out using quadrats, 5 placed on each transect, evenly spaced, half-metre square quadrats. I recorded species richness, percentage cover, and floral density. In total, I had 600 quadrats, 57 species were recorded. Alongside wildflower surveys, carried out bumblebee surveys. This was done using bee walk methodology, so a slow walk along each transect, recording any bee you see within 2 metres in front of you and 2 metres either side. I recorded the species, the caste, so whether it was a queen, a worker, or a male, and a floral association, so whatever that bumblebee was doing at the time, whatever flower it was on, was noted. 120 transects in total, and I recorded 12 species. So this is my primary finding, but I want to give you a quick overview of the slide before I continue. So on your left, you can see bumblebee species richness. On your right, you can see abundance. And on the x-axis, you can see the habitat types which we've just discussed. Look at the difference between out of play and everything else. The out of play habitats support significantly higher levels of species richness and abundance than both rough and fairway. This held true throughout every test I ran. The difference is stark. The bumblebees are concentrated in this floristically rich area. But now look at rough and fairway. They're almost identical. There's no significant difference. So why is rough failing to perform? So the rough habitat on your left receives less management input and management intensity than fairway, yet the floristic baseline appears too impoverished to respond. If the flora isn't there, if the flowers aren't there, simply cutting it less isn't enough. And on your right, you can see the out of play habitat. This has benefited from decades of low input and low intensity management. And it's allowed a genuinely rich floristic sward to come through, and the bumblebees are responding there. So the rough, the cut height is constrained by the playing surface, but the fertiliser input isn't. So, in the nutrient poor, sandy sites, which I did my surveys on, a reduction in fertiliser input could shift the competitive balance in favour of low-growing forbs like white clover, bird's foot trefoil, allowing them to establish without having to adjust that mowing regime. And here, throughout my study, more wildflowers meant more bumblebees. And on courses where this wildflower, yellow rattle, was present, significantly higher levels of bumblebee species richness and abundance were observed in comparison to where they were absent. Why? Well, yellow rattle is a hemiparasitic wildflower. It suppresses the roots of dominant grasses by parasitising them. It thins out the sward and allows more wildflowers to proliferate. It's a real meadow maker. It's cheap, it's self-seeding, and it does the active intervention for you. So, where yellow rattle was present, wildflowers followed. And where wildflowers followed, bumblebees would respond. So, this is a red shankarda, Bombus rudorarius, photographed by myself on one of the study sites in Sandwich Bay. It's a section 41 species. It's rare and it's scarce. It's declining. It's legally protected as requiring conservation action in the UK under the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act. This is because it's experienced a 42% decline in occupancy since 1980. It's following the same trajectory, perhaps, as the short-haired bumblebee before it. And of the 23 individuals that I recorded, every single one was in Sandwich Bay. The same 3 sites with conservation designation and the same 3 sites with yellow rattle. But here's the critical detail. Queens of the species can disperse across entire landscapes. So if I recorded a queen on one of my study sites, it wouldn't tell me very much. But critically, I recorded both workers and males. Workers forage locally, close to the nest. This appears to confirm that there are active, reproducing colonies on these sites. So they're not just supporting bumblebees generally, they seem to be acting as a source population for declining species, producing the colonies that sustain wider populations across fragmented landscapes. And this slide here just demonstrates that diversity at play. So this was on the same morning as that red-shanked carder was taken, the photograph of the red-shanked carder was taken. There's 3 more bees there, and there was more on that day as well. It just shows that the habitat's there and the habitat's really well managed. So what do we do with this? What does this mean? So I concluded that management intensity seems to matter more than designation status and landscape position. And it's those floristically rich, structurally diverse and proportionally dominant parts of the golf courses that do the conservation heavy lifting, the out of play habitat. And the rough could be nudged in a really positive direction. Yellow rattle is cheap, self-seeding, and as we said, does the active intervention for you. It's got the potential to trigger this beautiful ecological cascade where you get more wildflowers, more bumblebees, and fingers crossed, more rare species. Third, 124,000 hectares of almost entirely untapped conservation potential on these sites. If even a modest fraction adopted evidence-based management, the impact on pollinator networks in the UK could be substantial. But this isn't just about golf courses. Any managed green space could do this, from roadside verges to the very campus grounds that we walk on. It could be applied to any green space that prioritises aesthetics over ecology, exactly like Sandwich Bay are doing. So the solution to pollinator decline does not require new policy, new land, new money, not necessarily. It's just a different relationship with the land that we already own and manage. And the photograph behind me, the red-shanked carder, nationally rare, scarce, foraging on clove-scented broom rape, protected, shows that in action. So the solution isn't a new nature reserve, it's already there. We just need to manage it a bit better. Thank you.
Afternoon. So I will be speaking to you this evening about zoos and their contribution to national policy and to parliamentary debate. So, environmental policy. We know that this is essential to solving large-scale conservation and sustainability problems. Policy affects everyone and everything, and even policies that seem completely unrelated to biodiversity have knock-on effects. That's everything from trade to land use and even, dare I say it, the COVID-19 pandemic. Policy is aimed at changing behaviour to normalise pro-environmental action, or, on the contrary, minimising environmental degradation. But we know better than to assume that writing a policy means it will suddenly solve the world's problems. In reality, a lot of policy is poorly designed, lacking evidence, and unattainable, so unenforced. Even some of the most renowned environmental policies have their limitations. CITES is designed to restrict trade of endangered species, but it's been demonstrated that some of the clauses have been difficult to translate into national policies, leaving gaps in the conservation landscape. So science is the solution. If we can provide evidence of species behaviour, trade routes, people's opinions on policy, then we can help fill these gaps and make policy more effective. Maybe that's easier said than done. There's a bit of a barrier between professionals in the science field and the policy field. Some of this does just stem from a bit of a distrust and unwillingness to communicate. I'm afraid that as scientists, we have a bit of a reputation for sitting on our high horse, providing knowledge and just assuming that by doing so, that will have the domino effect and the policy outcome will be reached. But any politician will tell you that's not the case. Anything that we publish can be debated and will be debated and may not have a given outcome. Secondly, scientists don't know how to talk to non-scientists, and policymakers don't know how to translate science. This is definitely a sweeping statement, but it's really important to remember that parliamentarians quite often haven't even looked at science since their GCSEs. The alternative is, of course, that we start publishing in policy documents, things like post notes. But a lot of scientists choose not to engage with these, partly because scientific success is measured through journal publications, so there's no incentive to provide answers there. And finally, conservation is not on the agenda. We do have a bit of a habit of complaining about this in conservation. And it's true, governments absolutely have other priorities. These immediate problems always end up coming first, but it is definitely our job as scientists and as conservationists to make it relevant. So we need an institution that understands science and conservation, but is also good at engaging with a variety of audiences. Zoos could be the solution. Now, yes, these were established as menageries of animals, visitor attractions, and frankly, for economic benefit. But in the modern day, zoos are being asked to do more. And Spooner and colleagues have developed a model that includes 7 societal roles. We have conservation, education, research, public health, financing conservation, contributing to the economy, and contributing to policy. Zoos are in a very unique position on the fence between the human world and nature. On the one hand, they have to understand animal biology, animal welfare, conservation objectives in order to look after the animals in their care. But on the flip side, zoos are absolutely driven by non-experts, and by that I do mean visitors. They have to operate as a business. They need to understand how to communicate with these people that don't necessarily understand the science behind their work. And this puts them in a really unique position with policy. Now, most of these roles have been assessed to some extent, but policy remains somewhat understudied. So I aim to look particularly at national policy, which is a focus on my placement year at Chester Zoo, to see how well zoos are influencing this field. Now, measuring influence is really hard. It's really hard to attribute one action to one output when there are so many inputs involved. But it has been suggested that the simplest way to measure impact of an organisation is just to count how many times it is mentioned. Because fortunately, in policy, we are quite good at mentioning where information has come from. So I applied this to the corridors of power themselves, by which I mean the Houses of Parliament. Every debate ever recorded, to an extent, in Parliament has been written down in a system called Hansard. Now, these were originally published in books, which we do actually own copies of in the library, but fortunately for me, since 2010, everything has been digitised. And that meant that I could search for all mentions of zoos since 2010. So I searched Hansard for all mentions of zoos since 2010, and I also searched for a selection of NGOs over a 5-year window, 2021 to 25, to provide a baseline. These were the RSPB, WWF, Wildlife Trusts, and Born Free. I contextualised each of these mentions into the traditional roles of zoos as visitor attractions and animal housing, and the modern social roles that I spoke about earlier. And this gave me the ability to analyse any trends in the mentions over time and compare zoos and NGOs. There was a lot. I had 922 mentions of zoos in total and 505 mentions of the selected environmental NGOs. Fortunately for me, Ella also very kindly agreed to contextualise some of these mentions for me, which meant I could run a Cohen's-Kappa analysis and confirm that we identified the context with substantial to perfect agreement, meaning that my analysis would be more reliable. So, zoos are mentioned more frequently over time, and this implies they are having a higher influence. We can see a particular increase in 2019 to 20, and it's really important to note that this is when both Chester Zoo and ZSL employed their first policy advisors. We can also see a peak around the COVID era, which is, of course, involving a lot of conversation about reopening zoos, but also, therefore, their role in society and how they were contributing to the rest of life. Finally, in 2024, we can see a bit of a peak, which is when the ZSL lease came up for renewal because they are on royal land, and therefore that gets discussed in Parliament. But that doesn't tell us much about exactly how we're talking about zoos. And so I wanted to have a look at how they are mentioned by context. The traditional roles of zoos, which are on the left, are still dominating conversation. It's really important to note, though, that this does have its reasons. There are obviously ethical implications about zoos, and we can't argue with that. And therefore, animal housing is a really common topic. But a lot of this was mentioned in the positive, the vast majority, and using zoos as an example for how other institutions should take care of animals. Secondly, as a visitor attraction, there are, of course, massive implications for the British economy, and therefore that was quite relevant to discussion. Conservation is another highly mentioned topic, which is really promising for zoos. This is one of the oldest roles of zoos. Pretty much as soon as people realised that we can't really just keep animals for the sake of it, conservation became a primary objective. The other modern roles are mentioned less frequently, but I wanted to see whether this is just because it's a new topic and evolving over time. So I did find that the context that zoos are referred to has changed, but I'm afraid not very much. I analysed the context as a percentage of total mentions per year and found that zoos are mentioned proportionately more as conservationists and for financing conservation. As conservationists, this is one of the primary rationales for keeping zoos open in the modern day, so it's no surprise that as zoos are starting to interact more with policy, this might come up more in discussion. For financing conservation, on the other hand, governments are having challenges in this field. This means that if zoos can maybe perform that function for them, then that might make them more relevant. There were, however, no other significant trends in context over time. But I wanted to see if this was the only way of analysing it, or maybe we could see more detail in the topics of discussion. So I analysed when zoos are mentioned in environmental topics. I classified environmental topics as anything relating to sustainability or species and habitat conservation. Mentions of zoos are including significantly more environmental topics since 2010. Now, environmental topics have been increasing on the political agenda, and they're now used to sway support, especially in elections. So this could just be tracking a trend of more environmental topics coming up in Parliament over time. However, regardless, it's really promising that zoos are playing a part in this discussion, and as the topic grows, zoos are going with it. Now, how do zoos compare to NGOs? I decided to analyse only the 4 most common categories of modern roles of zoos, and I measured these as a proportion of mentions per year due to the fact that I was only looking at a handful of NGOs. There are significant differences between the context of mentions of zoos and other environmental NGOs. We can see that in the conservation context, these actually sit in a very similar position. However, there are more NGO mentions for research and policy, and more zoo mentions as educators. Now, NGOs and zoos obviously both fill a conservation role, but they take very different approaches to this, and we can see this also in their mission statements. NGOs are quite often taking a national approach to policy and a national approach to research and conservation, which you can see just in the number of RSPB designated sites, or letters to government or petitions that NGOs are involved in. Zoos, on the other hand, quite often take an international approach. And this is less likely to come up in UK government conversations. Likewise, for their research, they're looking at international goals. On the other hand, as educators, zoos are directly influencing UK citizens. And therefore, governments care what their citizens and their voters are getting in terms of outcomes. So in conclusion, zoos are probably having a higher influence upon policy, and I have to caveat that because it's almost impossible to say they definitely are. Zoos are noted increasingly for their conservation work as well as financing conservation. But these are for very different reasons, one zoo-driven and one government-driven. Not all of the social functions of zoos are mentioned equally. And my challenge to you would be, does this matter? Are zoos fulfilling this role and just not being mentioned in Parliament? Or are they not fulfilling them at all? Which I would encourage you to look at the other research on zoos. Now, zoos are also increasingly mentioned in environmental debates, which is really promising for their conservation objectives. Although it's hard to say whether this is just because the environment is becoming an increasing topic, I think it's really important that zoos are contributing to that as it grows. NGOs and zoos both perform similar functions, but they do them at different levels and take different approaches, and this is evident through Parliament. But there are a lot more questions. This is a really novel approach to this kind of research and to the policy sphere in zoos at all. I'd really encourage people to look into other methods to analyse political function, analyse how zoos versus NGOs are approaching these topics, and whether one is more effective than the other. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming today. I'm going to be discussing with you some data I collected when I was in Peru on a group of 11 captive spider monkeys. I'm looking at their behaviour and their reintroduction suitability, as this is in a rehabilitation and release centre, so hopefully all animals will end up going back into the wild eventually. So pre-release behavioural assessments are really important. Reintroduction is really important for restoring population viability, enhancing genetic diversity and strengthening fragmented ecosystems, but it is highly contested. There is a high number of post-release mortality, as well as a need for standardised baseline comparisons, because the assessments, as you'll see as I go through, they're kind of all over the place. And a lot of that is because behavioural components aren't assessed properly in pre-release. So I got ethical approval from the University of Kent, and then I collected my data and designed it with the approval of the Rainforest Awareness Rescue Education Centre, or RAREC, in Peru. I did a structured ethogram, which I've done a little, I'll give you a proper look at it in a minute, a little glimpse of what that looked like here, which is basically just a list of all the behaviours that I was looking for, what the behaviour was, the definition, things like that. I randomised my sampling 5 times a week between 5:30 and 6 p.m. because I was looking to get a full circadian rhythm for each individual. I collected both quantitative and qualitative data because I wanted to be able to run statistics, but I also like the nuance and the information that qualitative data gives you. I also did 4 weeks of group scan observations, which was very much needing to be qualitative because trying to take that much data as one person is pretty much impossible. So. And then I recorded data with triggers, durations, and this was what it ended up looking like. So this was my work board. There was a lot of things I needed to write down, so it was very difficult to be flipping through pages and whatnot. So this is what I came up with. I've glued my ethogram at the top, then I had all my codes here. This is my locomotion sheet. Basically, I split colours into every 10 minutes, and I'd have the coloured pens there because I was trying to see how movement changed throughout time, locomotive complexity and things like that. And then I had the very, very long and arduous task of trying to get this onto a computer. I do not recommend it. It took a very, very long time. This is what my locomotion looked like. We've got the colours representing the 10 minutes. I had one of these for every hour, and then the counts of each locomotive behaviour that I saw within each area. There's a lot of things that I've looked at, such as area and whatnot, which I'm not going to be able to go into in this. I've had to really cherry pick it to try and fit it into the 15 minutes. But this is what the digitised version of my behaviour account was. So I've got a member code, 1 to 11 members, observation slot. There was 10 slots, each of an hour long. And then I grouped those into primary behaviours, secondary behaviours, what the behaviour was, what triggered it, the duration, who was doing it, who received it, was there anybody missing, where it was done, and then obviously qualitative notes. So this is Diego, or member number 1. I have 3 graphs for every single one of these, so I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to go into them into too much detail, but just as a highlight, I thought maybe we could look at the 2 biggest behaviours per group. So this is the percentage of the total actor time, so the total amount of time that they were doing actions within their specific data collection. So for Diego, the top ones we have are affiliative behaviour and self-care. I then made a graph to look at where each behavioural group where this behaviour was directed. Because it's all well and good to say, oh, there's affiliative behaviour, but we need to know, is this going towards group members? Is it going to humans? Is there humanisation? What's the vigilance? What are they looking for? So I don't know if you can see very well because it's quite a big graph and I was trying to fit it into a very small area. But orange is humans, external animals is pink, external environment is green, no recipient is grey, but just to give you a general idea. Now, the one thing I would probably pick out on here that I'm a bit not concerned about, but something that might be worth noting is the high level of human curiosity for Diego. Low levels of human conflict and aggression, which could be just due to obviously they're in a cage and they don't really understand. This can be quite overstimulating having these humans around you and whatnot. So out of his, I'd say that his behaviour and its direction is looking pretty good. The only thing that I'd say we maybe need to work on is the curiosity. Then I'm actually really happy with this. This took me a while to make. I panned together all of their observation slots in the 10-minute points for each locomotion and then made it into a full range. I ended up having 30-minute gaps in places because of the way I structured my data. So if I did that again, I would try and kind of close those gaps. But you can see here that there's a real spike in kind of movement around this time. And this is generally when they get fed. And a lot of the time I would notice that when they were anticipating food, the behaviour spiked. This could be, again, food anticipation or maybe kind of a stress response from humans. Unfortunately, because I only did 1 week per person, it was really difficult to kind of narrow that down. You really need to do more studies for this. So Joe is very similar, affiliative behaviour and self-care. Directionality, the big thing that struck me here was that his conflicts and aggression was disproportionately large towards humans compared to other directions. The thing I did notice with Joe, though, is that actually within the group, he wasn't actually that conflictual. I think that's a word. And this could be due to him feeling stressed out in his environment. And again, just having humans around all the time, not understanding why you're in a cage, things like that. Now, as you can see, his locomotion type is very different. But again, we have that peak around feeding time. And I think the second feeding time is around here. And this is, I don't think I mentioned my weather code, this is rain. So I've got gradients of blue for levels of rain, gradients of yellow for sun, and grey for overcast. And this is quite normal. This is what you'd expect in the wild. When it's raining, they tend to stay up on the platforms 5, or in case of the wild, in the trees, and not do a lot. Again, self-care and affiliative behaviour for Joaquin. His directionality, curiosity, he tends to be more curious actually in relation to his environment, so twigs and sticks on the floor, which is the kind of thing that you'd want to see. But I did notice that there was quite a lot of subordination behaviour with Joaquin. As you can see here, he's kind of covering his testicles. And if you approached the fence to him, he would kind of come up to you and do this in a kind of subordinative manner. Which is something that you'd maybe want to watch, because if you're in the wild, say people are trying to poach you for the illegal wildlife trade and you kind of have that subordination behaviour, it's going to make it a hell of a lot easier for them to do that. It's also worth noting that he did have malformed fingers on his left hand, and I did notice him struggling with brachiation at times, and at times he would be moving with just one hand. He did manage to move around without any significant issues, but just something worth noticing. Again, we've got that peak. When human presence is expected, when the food is expected. But he was a bit different actually during rain, and I remember this very vividly. He became incredibly stressed when it started raining. I had a coding for agitated locomotion, which is essentially when they're moving around the enclosure in an agitated manner. And when it was raining, he really did not like it. And that's why there was a bit of a peak there. Again, self-care and affiliative behaviour for Sarita. Sarita did show a lot of curiosity and communication directed at me, especially when she saw me, which is slightly concerning. Obviously, we don't want them to be calling out to humans and whatnot to survive in the wild. It can put them in danger. And she spent a lot of time watching me. And you can see in the vigilance, there's a big bar for orange as well. So it's worth considering how we can minimise humanisation in Sarita's case. Again, seeing that peak when we're expecting humans and we're expecting food. And now spider monkeys in the wild, you might not know, but they travel a really long period of time to get their food. It's very uncertain where they're going to be getting their next meal from. And this is something that it would be good to work on. Self-care and affiliative behaviour. Margarita was a lot more what you'd expect to see. She was very group focused. She showed very little interest in me or other humans. There was the occasional call towards me, but very rare, and this isn't something that I think is cause for concern. So Margarita, based on the data that I have, I was actually quite happy. There wasn't a massive peak when she expected the food. There was a bit slightly later, but if I remember correctly from my data, that's because she was playing, so that would be why she was moving around more. Again, self-care and affiliative behaviour. Curiosity for Abby, a lot of curiosity to humans. She would often come to the fence to try and speak to me, similar to Sarita, something we need to work on. But with the locomotion pattern, you can see that there's a lot less movement compared to the others. And actually, as I'll show you later, when comparing to wild baselines, that's a little bit of a concern because they spend a lot of their time travelling in the wild, so we really want to try and get that movement back up. Self-care and affiliative behaviour. But there's a big issue with the curiosity. Now, Emma actually had a lot of people bullying her, but she really showed a disinterest in the rest of her group members. And the majority of the time she would follow me around and just sit there watching me, which is obviously really not very good. So that's something that definitely needs to be worked on for Emma. There's good locomotion, but the diversity isn't as good. We want to see complexity because it shows ecological adaptation. And it also shows neurological capacity, just being able to adapt and whatnot. So I think we're starting to see a trend here, self-care and affiliative behaviour. Donna, see, it's 50-50, but I'm not too concerned about this because there was actually only 2 recordings of curiosity. Donna does have cancer and a chronic heart condition, so realistically she isn't a candidate for release. But apart from that, generally very group focused. This is kind of what we want to see. Looking into the internal environment, being aware of your surroundings, especially when you're in that enclosure. There's all sorts of things, there's conflict and you need to be aware of where you're eating and things like that, so it's good to be aware of your surroundings. Again, a peak when we're expecting the food, no movement during the rain, which is good. Again, continuing the trend, self-care and affiliative behaviour, but high curiosity towards humans. As you can see, Sandy used to like to reach for me through the fence, which is all very cute and very lovely, but not ideal in a released context. So really we want to look at trying to minimise human interaction, minimise humans being around her. But good locomotion, she's very consistently moving about, but yeah, again, with humanisation, it's something we need to focus on. Now, Pepita kind of took a little bit of a turn here because she would spend a lot of time just looking outside and just relaxing with other people. She was my non-complicated queen. She was a very, very lovely animal, but she didn't show a lot of, what's the word? Diversity, I think is what I was looking for, but it's gone now. But as you can see, she's extremely group focused. She gave me a very matriarchal role within the group. She was always watching over people, very non-conflict. And this was actually really unusual for her. And this is the issue with only doing a week survey for each monkey, because actually Pepita didn't play very often. And in the week that I surveyed her, she was doing it all the time. So it creates disproportionate data, which I won't be able to prove because I've only got a week's worth of data. Gia, again, self-care and affiliative behaviour. And she was very focused on the group, spent a lot of time playing. And as you can see, she was extremely erratic, moving around a lot, very diverse. So what I've done is I've put all of their behaviours into one table, percentage of each person's total time spent on each behaviour. And then what I did is I collected the mean percentage of time for each behaviour because they're social creatures and they can't be released unless they're in groups. And then I got wild conspecific baselines. So I looked up the literature of what wild spider monkey time budgets are. But there was an issue. So I've collected 15 behavioural groups, but there was only 4. And this shows a real issue with the nuance of data that we actually have in this literature. So in the dark here, I've got the data I collected, the light grey is the wild conspecific. I'm not overly concerned about the high level of social or other. I did collect a lot of behaviours that weren't included in these 4. So obviously that's going to push that out disproportionately. Resting is nice, where we'd expected. But foraging and travelling, which can be expected within an enclosure, was lower than what you'd like to see. Directionality, the majority of curiosity was towards humans, but apart from that, if we're looking at them as a group on the whole, it was very member-focused, enclosure-focused and environment-focused, so that is good. This is an affiliative network, so because they're social creatures, it's so important for them to have that solid structure. And as you can see, there's none of them on the edge. There's connections to all of them. So this is really what we want to see. I've got total duration, the thicker the line, the more time spent in affiliative behaviour, the codes for the members and their colours, and then obviously the direction of the arrow was where it was going. So it's nice to see that it is a real cohesive group, there's no real issues here. Conflict and aggression, you can tell that M1 or Diego was one of the more dominant types. He did not really receive any conflict or aggression. It is worth noting that I have avoidance under conflict and aggression, and that was what Donna or M8 did. There wasn't any overt aggression or conflict towards him, just avoidance, which it was the best group for me to fit it in. So a lot of limitations with this research. It's really hard trying to collect this much data as just one person. I didn't have very long to do it. As I said, I only had a week to do for each member, and there's only so much you can do with that. You don't get any long-term behavioural information. You don't get any environmental factors, seasonal changes. As I was in one spot, and I was trying not to kind of approach the enclosure too much, when they would go up onto the top levels of Area 5, a lot of time I couldn't see them. So I had to create a generalised code, U for unrecognised for any members under 6 that I couldn't see, but I could see were present, and G for group, meaning more than 6 members, but I wasn't able to name them. As mentioned, there's a lack of conspecific data for in the wild, so it's really hard to actually compare properly. And behaviours, opportunistic behaviours I might have missed based on the way that I set up my study and my observation periods. So the two main deficits of the group were foraging and travelling, and these actually really link in together. As I mentioned, in the wild, they spend a long period of time travelling and foraging, and it's difficult to change this within an enclosure structure, especially somewhere that's a non-profit that is really relying on donations. It's really hard to kind of make these changes. So focusing on what you could do in the short term, increasing natural browse, so leaves, things that they'd find in the wild, and preparing the food a little less. So we used to chop up the bananas quite a lot, which obviously isn't relative to how it would be in the wild. So slowly reducing the preparation of that and changing the times that it's given and the area it's given. So by putting it in different areas, you're encouraging them to move about to do the foraging. And as you saw with the locomotion often spiking when they were expecting food, if we can change the time that they're expecting it, it reduces that dependence on it. And then, yeah, putting it in different areas and whatnot. If they can get some more funding, it'd be really nice to see some canopy-linked enclosures or more enrichments or just complexity to the structure at the arboreal level. And this is an ongoing project at RAREC, actually, which is absolutely fantastic, but because of erosion and funding limitations, it's had to take a back seat. But this is an on-site island where they can be within their naturally environmental habitat, where they can still be observed. It's controlled, they can make sure that they're ready. It's like a pre-release kind of setting. And because it is on that island, it reduces that human interaction and that human appeal, which can help with the over-humanisation within certain members. But again, it's very much reliant on funding, so it's very difficult. But this is a fantastic project that they have going on, which I'd really like to see them continue. And I do want to say a massive thank you to them. It was an absolutely amazing experience. If anybody's interested in volunteering or doing an internship there, please reach out to Katia. If you do feel like donating, I'm not going to be that person that's like, please donate £1 or £2, but if you can, that's a QR code. It will take you to the donate page, and I'm sure they'd be really appreciative. And I think this slide kind of counts because I think we're all doing questions now. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.